So today will be a little bit different. I am not going to explore any particular historical theme, but I want to talk with you or ponder with you something about historical thinking, more broadly understood. Now, I think it's safe to say that human culture, almost all of it, is a product of our yearning for some measure of understanding, control, coherence, meaning amid the vast uncertainties of life. Science, philosophy, religion, poetry and the arts, technology, all of these are part of this meaning-making enterprise. Without it, we don't thrive very well. Now, history too takes part in this vast meaning-making enterprise. Historians do two things that relate to meaning. Number one is they record the meanings that other times and places have ascribed to their experience. Much of history is a record of how human societies and individuals have attached meaning to their experience. But historians do more than record the meaning of others. Historians also make meaning as they give some definition to the past. And that is the process I'd like to ponder with you today. The ways in which historians or people who do history, and in that sense, we are all historians because we all muse about the past. And so I want to ponder with you some of the ways in which historically and currently people who ponder the past have tried to find meaning in it. Now, the most common way of understanding time or history has been in terms of cycles, recurrent cycles. This has been in ancient times, though less so more recently, but in ancient times it has been perhaps the most common way of making sense of the past. It has been based largely on an alignment with the cycles of nature, sunrise, sunset, phases of the moon, seasons of the year, and so forth. So this notion of recurrent, repeating cycles has been central to ancient understandings of time. And this has been attractive because there is something comforting about aligning the historical process with the cycles of nature. Now, this has happened in the past at two levels. One is the cosmic level, and the other is the human level. For example, ancient Greek thinkers, such as Plato, thought in cyclical terms. He had a grand scheme, which I don't really understand very well, so I won't go into it. But it was framed in terms of cycles within cycles, wheels within wheels kind of thing, which he referred to as a great year. Even more elaborate than the Greeks in terms of cyclical thinking were the Hindus. They had vast cycles. The biggest one is known as a kalpa, supposed to have been somewhere around 4 billion years, which represented a single day for the creator Brahma. In China, the Taoists also thought of time as continuous change in which what they called the 10,000 things arise, transform, vanish, and then repeat all over again. Now, within these cosmic cycles, there have also been human cycles, cycles of human historical change. The Greek historian Polybius, or however it's pronounced, worked all of this out in some detail. He said that all states moved from monarchy to tyranny to aristocracy to oligarchy to democracy, from democracy to mob rule, anarchy, and then back again. There may be something to this. In in China, they have a different version of this. Well, it was really quite a similar version of this, that the dynastic cycles, Chinese divide up their history into various periods of dynastic role. And they too, like Polybius, thought that each dynasty rose to a period of efflorescence, to a cultural and economic peak, and then because corruption set in, they lost the mandate of heaven, and the dynasty fell, and another one took its place over and again. Now, the primary alternative to a cyclical understanding of time or of human history is what we might think of as a linear view of human history, in which the flow of events has a beginning, a middle, and it comes to an end. And it is this larger purpose that gives meaning in this kind of understanding of the past. It is the idea that the difficulties of life in our temporal world can be assisted if we can feel aligned with some larger purpose which is going to come to fruition. Now, this kind of thing probably began with Jewish thinkers. You may remember that the Old Testament begins with the beginning of time. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But the Jews did not only give history a cosmic starting point, but a historical starting point. And that, of course, was the exodus of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden on account of their disobedience. What followed, of course, was an interplay of human sinfulness and God's redemptive power that gets played out in human history, in the story of Israel's history, in the story of human history. And it ends in salvation or redemption, a messianic era of universal peace and justice, a return to Eden, as it were, and an end to history. Now, Christian thinkers built on all of this. They accepted the Jewish understanding of creation and the fall as the beginning of time or history. They too understood human history as the story of salvation, which is unfolding behind the scenes, as it were, of ordinary secular events. But these ordinary secular events were of minimal importance relative to the history of salvation that was unfolding behind the scenes. And Christians, like Jews, saw the goal of history as a grand redemption guided by the hand of God. The big difference, of course, for Christians is the centrality of Jesus. They understood Jesus, for the most part, as the singular incarnation of God, the fulcrum of history, therefore BC and AD. So in a strange way, the kingdom of God, in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, the kingdom of God had already come. It was a done deal, although it was not yet completely consummated. So this ambiguity between time being fulfilled and yet not yet consummated gave Christians hope. It allowed them to wait amid the intense suffering of ordinary history because they were aligned with an already accomplished fact. Now, the most well-known expression of this Christian linear view of time occurs in the writings of St. Augustine, especially the city of God. For Augustine, there were two realms. There was the city of God, which is a realm of spiritual purity, of eternal truth, of an unwavering focus on the divine, with its citizens pursuing justice and virtue and salvation. That's the top, the city of God. At the bottom is the city of man. It is the earthly realm. It is composed of power struggles, the pursuit of fleeting pleasures. It's driven by self-interest, pride, greed. And to Augustine, these two cities overlapped in time. And there was a lot of tension between them. That's what history is all about. But time and history had an end in Augustine's thinking. It was the day of judgment, the resurrection of the dead, the eternal happiness of the residents of the city of God, the eternal damnation of those who had not yet entered it. So, linear time in a religious context. Now, jumping ahead a little bit to the European Enlightenment of the 18th century, they put a different twist on linear time. They kept the notion of linear time, time as progress, essentially, history as progress, but they dispensed with God. For the thinkers of the European Enlightenment, the emphasis was now on human reason and scientific progress as the driving force behind historical change. Not God's sovereignty, not divine intervention, but human rationality expressed particularly in science. This led to the notion that society could steadily improve over time through rational action and scientific advancement. There was no need for a religious framework to explain progress or linearity in time. In fact, this secular view of linear time became a kind of religion that has embraced probably most of Western history for some time. We believe that things should improve. Let me highlight two exemplars of this approach in different ways. One was the 18th century writer named Condorcet. For him, we shall find in the experience of the past, in the observation of the progress that sciences and civilizations have already made, in the analysis of the progress of the human mind and the development of its faculties, we shall find the strongest reasons for believing that nature has set no limits to the realization of our hopes. Here is an optimistic view of time and progress. He also said elsewhere that the perfectibility of man is indefinite. You got that? The perfectibility of man is indefinite. Do you still believe that? It didn't go so well for Condorcet himself. He fell foul of the French Revolution, which he had championed, and died in prison. So I don't know if he would have repented any of his views at the end of his life, but certainly during his life, this notion of human perfectibility, of endless progress, and he traced that out through 10 major epochs, the last of which began with the French Revolution. Another twist on this notion of linear thinking comes in the thinking of Karl Marx. Marx lived at the intersection of three major developments. One was the Industrial Revolution, which created the conditions which Marx was protesting about, but it also created the conditions for the realization of socialism. The second was the French Revolution, which was a grand upheaval, which showed that this sort of thing could happen, and in his view, would happen again. And the third is the scientific revolution. Marx saw himself as a scientist. He had discovered the laws of historical development as certainly as Newton had discovered the laws of motion in the cosmos. So for Marx, socialism was not just a good idea, it was embedded in the very fabric of historical development. It was inevitable and it was certain. Now, here's the difference. Like Condorcet, Marx was a modernist, he was progressive, but the mechanism of progress was different. It was not reason and science, it was the clash of opposites. It was class conflict. I'm sure you have read the famous opening line of the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. And so for Marx, history went through these various phases, leading inevitably to socialism. Well, capitalism first, and then socialism. The outcome, of course, for Marx was revolution and communism. Listen to what he wrote. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each was the free development of all. It was, in the 19th century, a grand, compelling, prophetic, utopian vision of freedom and community. It provided inspiration for workers and intellectuals amid very difficult, harsh conditions of the early Industrial Revolution. It provided a template for the Russian and Chinese revolutions and several others as well. So Marx was an exemplar of this kind of linear thinking, driven not so much by reason and science, but by the clash of contending classes, which would result inevitably in a socialist or a communist society, and in one sense, the end of history. History had, in his view, would have more or less come to an end when this occurred. Now, everything that I've talked about so far was the product of amateur historians. None of these people were professional historians. It didn't exist. But lots of people then and now think about history without having a professional training. But by the middle of the 19th century, particularly in Germany, history, the study of history, became professionalized. It was embedded in colleges, in universities, in professional associations, in refereed journals, in regular historical conferences. And the earliest among these people was Leopold von Ranke. Von Ranke is considered to be sort of the father of modern scientific history. His approach was based on a rigorous process for determining what was a fact. It was based on extensive research, mostly in archives. It was based on a critical approach to sources and a striving for objectivity. Historians should focus on presenting facts, not their opinions, not their values, not their views, but just the facts, ma'am. Now, and he embodied this in a systematic way for training historians, what he called the seminar method, where students were not simply listening to lecturers from the great historian, but they were writing things, they were bouncing ideas off of each other. It was a Socratic kind of approach. But what von Ranke did was to align history with science, emphasizing its emphasis, imitating its emphasis on rigorous research methods. He was called the father of scientific history because he believed that it was possible to arrive at a considerable measure of certainty about the past. This is what he wrote. You have reckoned that history ought to judge the past and instruct the contemporary world as to the future. The present attempt, that is his writings, does not yield to that high office. It will merely tell how it really was. That was Ranke's famous phrase. I even know it in German. Wie es eigentlich gewesen. How it really was. And that effort to describe how things really were, objectively, with a considerable degree of certainty about this, was what von Ranke contributed to historical scholarship. And for much of the time, up until the Second World War at least, this is the understanding that prevailed in historical circles in the Western world. Since then, however, things have changed. The philosophical challenge to this kind of scientific history, which yielded certainty and objectivity, is sometimes known as postmodernism. It had an emphasis on subjectivity. It recognized that historians are entangled with the values and outlook of their own cultures. They are not sitting on the moon somewhere looking. They are as embedded in the historical process as anyone. Furthermore, there are differentials of power and privilege and authority that likewise shape the historian's writings. History may not have a purpose, but the writing of history had a purpose. And that purpose was to solidify and support established authority or to challenge it. Either way, objectivity and certainty is not the thing. It is part of the ordinary power dynamics of human society. History is not a simple matter of uncovering the facts and laying them out, but a complex process of controversy, of interpretation, where historical texts and historical arguments can be criticized. No end in sight. So meaning in history is anything but clear and certain. History is what we make of it, and it is shaped by the imagination and the circumstances of the historian. Alongside postmodernism came something else, a political challenge to scientific history called postcolonialism. Postcolonialism, very broadly, exposed the Eurocentric understanding of history as it was taught and written in the West. He objected to this kind of, the post-colonial writers objected to the centrality of European values and ways of thinking at the expense of other peoples, Asians, Africans, Latin Americans, Native Americans, and so forth. And so post-colonial history sought to incorporate the perspectives and the experience of colonized people. It sought to give voice to indigenous cultures, to resistance movements, to women, to the poor, and to other voices that had been marginalized or suppressed in the course of history. Now, all of this, postmodernism and postcolonialism, led to what I'm going to call the enlargement of history. Before the Second World War, most history written in this country or in Europe was state-based. It was political history. It dealt with political and military leaders as the major drivers of the historical process. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, and perhaps because of it, new perspectives emerged. One of them is called social history, or history from below, which focused on the lives not of the elite, not of the powerful, but of ordinary people. It explored issues of gender, class, race, family, health, migration, poverty, crime, and it considerably enlarged the scope of historical content. In the 1980s and 90s, a parallel kind of history came into view. It's sometimes called cultural history or the history of mentalities. History of mentalities, which focused on ideas, beliefs, art, music, fashion, everyday practices, everyday rituals, The culture of food and the culture of clothing, for example, are things that have been focused on here. Traditional historians looking at the Battle of Waterloo would focus their attention on military strategy. But these social and cultural historians would focus their attention on how soldiers spent their time in the camp, what games they played, how they felt about the upcoming conflict, what food they ate, how they washed, or in fact, most often did not wash. So these kinds of history greatly enlarge the scope of historical thinking. And all of that was embodied in world history. World history was a post-war phenomenon. It grew out of the wars. It grew out of the recognition that a nation-based outlook had given rise to tragedy beyond imagination or description. And the idea was that if we could have a different kind of history, a history not of this nation or that nation, but an inclusive history, a history of the whole of the human species, that this would be a big improvement, and it might in fact mitigate against the kind of disasters that had befallen the world in the first half of the 20th century, the two world wars and so forth. So world history operated on the assumption that there is a history of humankind as a whole that exists alongside the particular histories of France or Germany or the United States. Another focus of world history was an emphasis on encounters, on interactions, rather than on what was happening within particular societies or civilizations. And so world historians came to focus on things like long-distance trade, migration, the spread of religious ideas into new areas, large-scale empires, the transmission of disease, all of these things which brought culturally different people into interaction with one another. It meant that there is a meaning to the human story as a whole, alongside the meanings that were inherent in national or civilizational histories. Now, in the 1990s, there was a further iteration of world history, which has come to be called big history. Big history. And it basically asserts that history is not only a phenomenon of human life, but of the entire cosmos. The cosmos, the universe, has a history. It began with the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, or so we are told. It traces the evolution of stars and galaxies. At some point, the focus narrows to the Earth, but we don't get to human beings for a very long time. You know, the Earth is probably 4 billion or so years old. Life began around 3.5 billion up, so they say. And that whole process has a history, some of which can be uncovered. So the creation of the Earth and its many geological changes, the beginning and evolution of life, along with these periodic extinction events when pretty much, well, when a large percentage of living things were lost, you know, up to 80% or more of them on some occasions. So if context provides meaning, and I think it does, big history offers the largest possible context for establishing meaning in the human story. Professional history these days has little interest in speculative philosophical underpinnings of history. Most historians operate without any sense that there is a grand meaning or purpose to the human story. But they reject, and all of us, I think, reject the idea that history is just one damn thing after another, or as Macbeth put it, a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Signifying nothing. None of us want to believe that. We may, in our dark moments, come to that conclusion, but we do not want to believe it. And most historians do not either. So the question that I want to finish with is, in what ways do historians affirm or create meaning, coherence, significance in the absence of any large purpose or goal to the whole process? I have a number of ways in which we do this. One is chronology. We divide history up into periods of time. The biggest division in human history is apparently one can sum up the whole of human history in three major periods. The longest is the Paleolithic era of hunting and gathering societies, which occupies roughly 95% of the time that human beings have been running around here on the planet. About 12,000 years ago, of course, agriculture was invented in a number of different places and became largely universal by, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And then in the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution arguably marks a third major phase of the human story, and it's only been around for what, less than 2 centuries, so who knows if it's going to last very long. But in any event, it is a way, chronology, or what historians call periodization, is a way of bringing some sort of order to a big and complicated story. For example, now, many scholars are arguing that there is a new phase of human history now known as the Anthropocene, which means that more than ever before, the history of the Earth is being shaped by human activity. Not so much by nature, by winds, by erosion from the rise and fall of mountains, but by human activity, the Anthropocene. And actually, this is a geological term. It is geologists who are claiming that we have now entered a new geological period that is shaped by human activity rather than by natural forces. A second way that we have of giving some measure of order, coherence, significance to the human past is in the units of analysis that we use. Now, some of these are old and they're still around. We talk about what happened within particular states, empires, nations, or civilizations. But more recently, we've also begun to use new units of analysis, not just these older ones, but for example, there is a thriving field of historical study known as Atlantic history. It looks at the interactions that have occurred between Europe, Africa, North and South America over the past 500 years. And this is a new unit of analysis. An older unit like it is the Indian Ocean. There are a lot of scholars who pursue the task of looking at what happened in the basin of the Indian Ocean from ancient times up to the present. A third way that historians use to make some modest sense out of things has to do with cause and effect. It is, of course, central to history. It's central to any kind of understanding, I suppose. It answers the why question. We want to know, it seems to be fundamental to human consciousness to know why things happen, not just what happened, but why it happened. And here, historians sort of break down into two groups. One are those that look for the answer to the why question within particular society. And there's a lot of different things that can happen within particular societies that change historical evolution. The decisions of leaders, for example, great men, even generals. If you've been watching the Burns feature on the American Revolution, you know, you get some sense of the importance of George Washington and other of these great military leaders, many of whom goofed on occasion and things changed, and here we are. Marx, of course, highlighted class conflict within particular civilizations as the main driver of human affairs. Religious and cultural traditions have a role in shaping human development. There's a big debate, for example, about the influence of Enlightenment ideas on the American, French, Haitian, and Latin American revolutions. How important were the ideas of the Enlightenment to the outcomes or the process of these revolutions? And of course, technological innovation, which has occurred within particular societies, has a major influence, of course, as we know, on historical change. But as I mentioned earlier, world historians in particular focus less on what has happened within particular societies rather than what happens between them, on encounters of culturally different people, rather than an exclusive focus on what is happening internally. In this respect, world historians argue that we need to see all human societies as embedded in a network of relationship with both near and more distant neighbors, and to highlight the transforming power of cross-cultural interaction. Chinese history, to give just one example, was obviously shaped by their interaction over many centuries, indeed millennia, with the so-called barbarian peoples who lived north of the Great Wall. You can't understand Chinese history without understanding that this has been, for several millennia, a major factor in the shaping of Chinese history. Two other concepts that are useful to historians. One is conjuncture. That is the coming together of a number of different things at the same time. World War I, for example, is frequently explained in terms of conjuncture. The militarization of society, colonial rivalries, the system of alliances that the Europeans built up in the 19th century, all of these things contributed to the explosion which took place after the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in August of 1914. So none of these things by themselves might have generated World War I, but all of them coming together at a certain time had a powerful impact. The other thing is contingency. Contingency. This focuses on the role of chance, luck, the unexpectedness of the past. We can sometimes think of it as what if history. Let me give you an example or two. I've mentioned earlier that the Chinese in the 15th century launched an enormous maritime expedition into the Indian Ocean. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of people aboard those ships. It was an enormous expedition. They had within their hands the possibility of a maritime empire in the Indian Ocean. They said no. A new emperor came to the throne in 1433. He disavowed all of this and said, we're wasting our time out there in the Indian Ocean. The real danger is from the north. That's where the Mongols came from. That's where we need to pay attention. It's interesting to contemplate what would have happened if Vasco da Gama had sailed around the bottom of South Africa and into the Indian Ocean and confronted one of these huge fleets of Chinese ships. One can imagine that world history might have taken a different turn. All because the Chinese decided to let their fleet rot in port and to destroy most of the records from that fleet. Historians operate at a certain disadvantage because in general, we know that the end of the stories we tell. And it's easy to forget that the people who lived at that time did not. Much as we don't know what is going to happen in the next 3 years of the Trump administration with climate change, we are in the dark about all of that. When it is finally told, 500 years from now, if there are any historians running around then, they might see it as kind of inevitable. And I have a personal story about this, which I may have told you, forgive me. But the first time I went to Russia was in 1988. It was in the middle of the Gorbachev reforms. And we visited Lithuania and witnessed one of the first demonstrations in which the Lithuanians flew their own flag and began to talk softly about the possibility of independence from the Soviet Union. Well, we and everybody else thought this was nonsense in 1988. No possibility that little Lithuania could confront successfully the great Soviet Union. 3 years later, it happened. And a few years after that, I wrote a book about it, which probably implied that it was in the cards because I knew the outcome. But it has always been a cautionary tale to me to try to remind myself and my students that we do our ancestors a disservice if we do not acknowledge their uncertainty, their confusion in the moment, even if we, in retrospect, know what happened and think we can figure out why. So, conjuncture, contingency, and a third C is comparison. Comparison, of course, highlights what is common and what is distinctive. And comparison is a frequent tool of historians to attempt to establish some sort of clarity and definition. Comparison makes meaning by contrast. Let me give you just one example. Slavery in the United States, when compared with slavery in, say, Brazil, makes our slavery look very different by comparison. In the United States, slavery and racism gave rise to simply two categories of people, white and black, well, and also red for the Native Americans. But in Brazil, a similar slave society gave rise to dozens of mixed race categories. Whereas in the United States, even though there were a fair number of mixed race children born, they were not identified as a separate category. It was the one drop rule. You had even a little bit of African ancestry, you were black, period. That was not true in Brazil or in most of Latin America. So these kind of comparisons, and of course, historians, especially world historians, compare everything. We compare revolutions. We compare the difference between agriculture in the Middle East and in the Americas. We compare the difference between industrial revolutions in Russia and China and France and Germany. Everything is subject to comparison. And those comparisons often yield interesting insights about differences. We also try to identify patterns in history, such as the rise and fall of states which are often alleged to provide lessons that can be applied in the present. The fall of the Roman Empire, of course, has been the source of many lessons about history. There was an interesting book written about 10 years ago called Are We Rome, which argued that the overextension of our military power, corruption, our view of self and others was similar to what the Romans experienced, and that we should take notice. Wars, of course, are a sadly persistent feature of the human stories. Conflict among great powers, class inequality, patriarchy. More broadly speaking, historians have noticed two trends that we might say are that represent one way of giving some meaning to the human story. One of them is a trend in the direction of socioeconomic complexity. Modern societies are far more complex than hunting and gathering societies or agricultural villages. They simply have more moving parts. So the gradual evolution of complexity over time is a pattern that we can identify that may give some meaning to the human story. And so is connectivity or entanglement, or what we now call globalization. As I mentioned earlier in this series, globalization is not as new as we think it might be. It has a long legacy. It has a long history. It has been going on for quite a while. And the increasing entanglement of human societies with one another and all of the consequences of that is a major theme in human affairs. So, let me stop here and see what comments, observations you might have.
You mentioned that democracy and some people's view of it leads to mob rule. My question is, without leadership, when you have all these small groups in the world, in world history now, and all these small groups don't have a powerful leader that can unite a lot of smaller groups. So you have all of them clashing, and that becomes almost like mob rule. I mean, it's so many different people with so many different views with no one direction.
Yeah. And
for example, here's another example, and I'm sure you know this, is if you don't have one overarching power to control the sea lanes, like the British did, and now that we're doing, the Americans are doing, you can't really have safe world trade. You talked about this actually, I heard you say. I mean, and so you have to have some strong leadership to bring something of, I don't know what the word is, coherence, instead of mob rule. So what do you think?
John Adams. I've just been reviewing an interesting play by that my wife is putting on. It is the story of John Adams and the woman who printed the Declaration of Independence. And in the play, she had a conversation with John Adams, who argued much along the lines that you are suggesting. Except he said the problem with great men is that there are too many of them. And when one of them begins to have dominant power, what do we call that? Tyranny. Empire, yes. So,
here's another view of history that I've heard.
Yeah.
You're going to sorry about this. I just want to last point. Someone once said that bad times, hard times create strong leaders. Strong leaders create easier times, better times. Better times lead to weak leaders, and then weak leaders lead to hard times, and that cycle keeps going around. What do you think
you're
of
back to cyclical history.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah.
You spoke about that Frenchman that died at the Chateau d'If during the French Revolution, and his thing about our end is uncertain, you know, he said reason of humans moving forward. What was his name again? The Frenchman that died during the French Revolution?
Oh, Condorcet.
We were saying, yes, speaking about our outcome is uncertain.
No, he wasn't. He was dead certain that things were improving.
They were improving, but the eventual complete improvement is not certain.
Well, he thought it was, given it enough time. He didn't say that it was coming right away, but he wrote a book that outlined 10 major epochs of world history. And the last two were involved the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And this is when all these new things came into being. The notion of human rationality, of scientific advance, of progress. And he believed that progress was indefinite. The perfectibility of humankind can go on forever.
It's an indefinite without end. And so I believe that is not certain that it will be a positive outcome.
Yes.
You know, which is like when you speak about the earth as being one unit, so to speak, with many different people on it,
Yeah.
and that we all are transmitting all our information back and forth. Life is getting longer for most of us. These things are an improvement, but same fact that we have a way to end it on.
Yes. The mixture in personal life and in collective life. The great task is how to embrace the light and the shadow. And there's plenty of both in both personal life and in collective life. And how we handle that is, of course, beyond the ability of any ordinary historian like myself to comment.
Seems to be the history of humans and the history of art and war.
Yes, yes, yes.
I think that I and probably a lot of people have a fear of, I don't know if it's fear, but a pushing against this whole idea of the complexity of everything. You know, I tend to romanticize the past, thinking it was simpler, easier, and now it's like, I am not a stupid person, but I watch the news and I think, I don't even know what they're talking about sometimes. And it's a need to make some sense that is very elusive for me right now, and I work with my inner self to accept that and to relax around it and all that and not go crazy, but I think it's so complicated right now.
And one wonders if there is a limit to complexity before everything breaks down. When I'm stuck in traffic, that's what I think. This is how the world will end. There will be a global traffic jam, and we will all starve to death from our problems.
Has there ever been a republic that has survived for more than, let's say, half a millennium? I mean, look at the Romans, they didn't keep their republic very long. And the Greeks certainly didn't, right? And that's the big question for us, is can we keep this republic?
Yep, it certainly is. Certainly is. Plato said something that democracy leads to tyranny. It doesn't just precede it, it produces it.
Well,
Yeah, yeah.
of the founding fathers was who really wrestled with that. I mentioned before. The idea that you just said, that the democracy leading to tyranny.
Well, I think they all did. I mean, the founding fathers were pretty well versed historically, and they were thoughtful guys. So honestly, I don't know which one in particular. And you know the famous letter of Abigail Adams that she wrote to her husband when he was going off to the Constitutional Convention, is to remember the ladies.
Yes.
Remember the ladies, because she said, every man has the capacity and the desire to be a tyrant. And every woman would, if she could, rebel.
I don't think democracy is tyranny.
Okay,
I think everything can be tyranny. I think it's the fault of humans to want power and be greedy and
Okay.
selfish that leads to tyranny.
okay,
And that can happen at any juncture,
Okay,
whether it's
okay.
socialism or democracy or anything.
yes, yes. So you want to inject human agency into the equation? Yeah, okay, okay,
Wasn't it Ben Franklin said you have a democracy if you can keep it?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
You better have an educated public if you want to keep it.
Question, on the youth of today really studying these, learning about the past. I mean, I hate to say it, but I look at some of the interviews on television, and they can't even tell you who fought for it. I mean, some, it's sick, it's sad. And it's probably prevalent to a lot of people who know the name of every rock and roller, but they don't know the name. You know, the major forces that played by 1900s to the 20th century. I mean, and if we don't have that, what do we get?
Well, of course, now we have probably the most educated public in our history, and we have Trump.
Yeah.
I have a kind of a related question, which is, I guess, on the side of history, which is this, and it only gets bigger and bigger and bigger. How do we decide what to remember and what people should know in general? I'm not a historian, but I'm interested.
Well,
And it's daunting because there's just too much for one person to learn everything who's an amateur. So how do we decide what we should know? What are basic things that everybody really should know?
I suspect that in practice, what we do is we look at what is going on now and we ask questions about that in the past. It's no mystery why women's history has become a big thing in the last 50 years, because of the feminist movement. It's no mystery why environmental history has become a major field in the last 50 years. It's because of the environmental movement. We see in the present the things we are struggling with, and then we look to the past for some insight about how all this evolved. But for most of the time I've been talking about here, women were vanishingly rare in the in the historical records. Yes, in fact, and so was Africa. When I went to graduate school in the 1960s, African history was a new thing. When I took some African history courses, it was considered a new thing. Africa has a history. And that had a lot to do with nationalist movements, the advent of independence to so many of the African colonies, and their demands to have their history included in world history.
I'm wondering if you know the source of this quote. What we learn from history is the people who do not learn.
I don't know this whole thing, but I'm inclined to agree with the sentiment. You know, frequently it is said that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. A famous quote by Santayana, I think, some Latin American writer. But it's a little hard to point to things that we learn from history. Or sometimes we learn the wrong things from history. For example, the lesson of World War I was don't rush into war. Don't rush into war. Don't rush into war.
Make alliances.
August 1914.
When 1938 came along, we took that lesson to heart, and we did not rush into war with Hitler. But the Munich Agreement occurred, and 2 years later, we were in it. The lesson from World War II was, don't coddle dictators. When applied to Vietnam, it was a disaster. So it's more than a little daunting to actually come up with places in which we have learned from history in time to avoid similar mistakes. But of course, every situation is unique, and we operate in the moment. We're human. We're humans and limited.
We're not perfect.
Yes, yes.
It seems like the underlying theme is the struggle between the light and the dark, or the better sides of our nature and what we think of the world, of destruction, terrible behavior, and how we deal with that dark. I mean, I think begins by accepting that we all have both sides, and how do we deal with it? Can we do it in a kind, mindful way, or do we weigh the other guy and attack him for the parts we don't like in ourselves? It's a complex question. Yeah.
And of course, so many of these big decisions about war and peace are made in the moment without a great deal of reflection. And of course, in this atomic age, missiles that could cross oceans in a half hour, there's not a lot of time for reflection. Well, many thanks indeed. Right.